Okay. Uh, this is not going to be an exceptionally long session, um, as opposed to others that have been exceptionally long. Yeah, right. This is probably going to be, the best part of an hour, maybe. And then I will, we'll sort of call it quits as the group. And so, two things: you'll have the a little bit of extra time for the groups to work on the group project, which is due on the 5th. And so we're kind of coming down to the wire on that. And I'll make the first plea here: if at some point in time you don't, you feel like you need, a little extra help, or you need questions answered to, or answers to certain questions or whatever, as you work on these projects, feel free to contact me. And if I can respond by email, I'll do that. If we need to meet, in a Zoom one-on-one or one-on group or whatever, we'll do that. And so I'm going to make that offer 2 or 3 times tonight, just to make sure that you're aware that that offer's there. Because as a group, we're probably going to meet one more time. And that will be in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, we'll be having a bit more of a discussion about opportunity gaps and about the impacts of some of the evaluation issues related to school improvement. Next week, you will have time to meet as a group, looking at your original group that you did for the group project, as you work on your opportunity gap project. And you'll have the opportunity to kick that around with your group members a little bit, just to see if if it makes sense and if it's on target. And each one of you is doing a separate opportunity gap project, but I do want the groups to meet with an opportunity to sort of kick that around. And so we won't be meeting next week. We will be meeting the week after. So I guess the next time is 13th. Yeah, okay. I should know that. That's the day before my anniversary, my 42nd wedding anniversary. So and then that will probably be the last overall face-to-face meeting or synchronous meeting we do, simply because we'll be kicking those projects back and forth as I provide feedback on those. And so it'll be a little intense then for me to turn those around and make sure that you have plenty of time to do rewrites and things like that. So that's the reason we won't be meeting after that, as we get to the kind of final deadlines. And so that's part of what's happening next week, and part of the reason that I don't want to kind of spend a lot of your time talking about some couple of inane things that maybe you're not totally interested in anyhow. But the thing that I do need to talk about tonight is the North Carolina code and regulations surrounding school improvement and surrounding the governance of schools in general, because one of them flows out of the other. Some of this will be very familiar to you, some of it maybe not so familiar, but I'll also put it in kind of a historical context, going back to sort of the early education efforts in this country, and why certain things happened at certain points in time that led us up to the school models that we've been operating in now for the best part of 100 years. And so we'll kind of talk about those things. We'll talk about the way the funding has evolved, the way the federal roles and state roles and all have evolved. And then that'll lead us up to the looking very briefly at the actual North Carolina code as it has to do with the duties and responsibilities of State Board of Ed, which is a lengthy section of the code. So we're not going to dwell on it a lot. But then we'll spend just a little bit of time then on the section of the state code that deals with school improvement, because it has its own little section of the code in the North Carolina code. Any comments, questions about projects, any of that I may have rushed through there?
Dr. Bolt, how many pages is our program evaluation expected to be?
As long as it takes to adequately cover all the parts of the yeah, I tend not to do that, not to set, that or be this number of pages or whatever. Most of those run, probably 8 to 10 pages or 10 to 12 pages, something like that. Now it is APA, so you're talking about double space, and you're talking about 12-point font and things like that. So you find that 10 to 12 pages is not a lot of material. And so, some of them, I think, some of the projects might be able to run a little bit longer if you have a little bit more data you want to talk about. Some of them, I doubt you can do it justice in less than 8 or 10 pages at least. But I tend not to dwell on length simply because I think different people have different writing styles. And you can write 25 pages and not say a damn thing, and write 6 or 8 and have said a whole lot. So it really depends on writing style and the way in which you approach things. But just pay attention and make sure that you have dealt with all the items in the rubric and on the outline. Now, if I forget, are any of you in here in charter school settings? There are no charter school people in. Oh, Erica, are you in a charter school? Yeah.
Yes.
You may find the school improvement project a little bit different than the outline, because charter schools are not required by regulation to have school improvement projects. They're encouraged by personnel, but they're not required by regulation. And so I don't know, are you all working on a school improvement project?
Yes, so for my school, like you said, we don't necessarily have a school improvement plan, but we do have like goals. So I'm having to do a little bit more digging within my school, but
okay.
So far,
yeah,
so good.
If you'll just remind me of that in case I forget when you do yours, and just remind me with a little preamble or something, that you're working in charter school, because it's a different scenario as to how that works. And so I want to make sure that we cover, the difference there a little bit. But you're the only one. I don't think anyone else indicated they were. Okay. All right. Any other questions or thoughts? Now, here's my second plug. Remember, if you have questions and you think it might be useful that we speak to each other, face-to-face, one-on-one, we'll meet in Zoom. Or if you're in the group project, if you're working here in the next few days and you have some questions, I'm available. So, but it's up to you to reach out and make that contact, because I'm not going to require that you do that, but I am available, just so you'll know. Okay, so that's twice I've made that plug. Okay, I will make it at least twice more tonight, and just so on the video everyone is clear that I have made the offer a bunch of times. Just so I mean, I never know these things, classes like this. I'm trying to do a little bit different model from my end, in which we don't dwell too much face to face with me in terms of content pieces that you can readily read and that readily work into your projects. And I don't think there's anything that we've asked you to read that doesn't fit neatly into your sort of the projects that you were asked to do. And so, I'm not going to repeat things that you're obviously adult professionals and can read. So, but I do want you to know that if you do have questions or whatever, I am available and I will meet with you one-on-one, pretty much as I can schedule it. A lot of the weight on my shoulders was removed last week when I finished reading 6 or 8, I guess, 7 qualifying exams for doc students, and had 2 defenses last week, and now that season's over. So, the deadline was April 1st, so now we've got the entire month of April to dwell on your work and your projects. And so as they come in, I'm going to try to deal with those in a very expedited manner so that I can give you feedback with plenty of opportunity and with enough opportunity to, do corrections and rewrites and additions and things like that. So just keep in mind, if you do have questions, it'll be up to you to kind of reach out to me. Okay. I have many talents, but mind reading long distance is not one of them. I can generally do it within house, but I can't do it long distance. And I don't know you that well. Okay. Questions, thoughts, comments, statements like, I wish you'd shut up and just get on with what you're doing so we can get out of here. Any of those? None? Okay. All right. Just trying to encourage honesty and transparency. I have a fairly unique take on the history of education in America, because one of the things that I spent some time on years ago was editing and co-writing a couple of books on foundations of ed, or philosophy and history of education, basically. And so did an awful lot of digging and talking to people a whole lot smarter than me on that. And so I have a kind of a unique for a person whose fundamental job has been research and evaluation and all for the last 35, 40 years or so. I do have a little bit of a take on the history of things. And I think it's a shame that in our early history, our founding fathers did not really find education as something that was a national imperative and that needed to be dealt with in the Constitution or Articles of Confederation or any of those founding documents. But there is a reason why. And the reason why is that there was kind of a regional difference in perspectives on education and perspectives on public education. And if you go up in the New England area, you had the Puritans and the Pilgrims and all those groups that felt that from a religious perspective that it was important that everybody be literate and that everybody know how to count and do rudimentary mathematics, because part of being serving their God was to be smart about business and smart about money and smart about all those things. But they also believed that everybody had a one-on-one relationship with the heavens and with God. And you also had that one-on-one relationship with Satan. And so it was up to you to be literate enough to read the Bible and read all those important works that dealt with religion directly. And so they required that everybody have an education. And so the first thing they did was they built schools. And the first thing they did after that was they built institutions to prepare ministers and teachers. And one of the first of those, of course, is Harvard. And so it was a matter of it was a religious notion that everybody needed to have an education. And as the settlers expanded westward beyond New England and into the Green Mountains and the White Mountains and all that, they basically carried that thought with them. And so every village had to have a school. And very often in these villages, in these schools, there was a minister that ministered to the religious side of things in the church, and there was his wife or someone else that ministered to the education side of things in the school. Now, in the South, it was entirely different, since the South was settled by folks from whose background was more of a entitled background. A large number of the settlers to the South that weren't indentured servants or weren't prisoners were younger sons of families in England that didn't inherit. And so, you know, in most of Europe and England, there was the basic cultural notion was that the oldest son inherited everything. And that way they kept in the estates together. And they didn't, the wealth didn't dissipate. And so families kept their wealth or whatever they had, what little money they had, by allowing the eldest son to inherit everything. And then any younger siblings kind of lived at the mercy of the eldest son, or once they were provided with the opportunity to come to the New World, they came over and got land grants, which allowed them then to have, a pathway to wealth. And their history of education was one of private tutors. And so, and it was a very limited amount of education, basically doled out to the elder sons, younger sons, and then a little bit to the daughters, but maybe not so much. Because the basic role of the daughter was to try to go out and marry somebody that had some money. And, so it was, that was sort of the cultural mindset that came from, although it wasn't exactly truth of matters in a lot of cases. And so they didn't put any great value on public education, because education was the role of private tutors to a certain extent. And in the middle colonies, that's where all the workmen, mercantile, tradespeople, all that came and settled in the middle colonies, starting with what we would maybe today consider to be Maryland and Delaware, and maybe parts of Northern Virginia up through maybe New York and parts of New York or Southern New York and Jersey and all that. And so these were tradespeople, and they came from an educational history of apprenticeship. And so, everything, their educational focus was to a trade. And so that was not necessarily built around community schools. And then as we expanded westward, the only thing that we required as we expanded westward was that, if you built a village or if you built a town, you had to build a school. Because the thought was you're kind of on your own out there. And so, what little you could pick up from schools, you kind of really needed to do that. You couldn't depend upon the family to do that. They'd be too busy, farming the land or fighting off the savages or, whatever else it was that were moving west. And so it was a very, very discombobulated educational system that, led into the Civil War, leading into the Civil War. And so there wasn't a lot of thought about public education before then. Some parts of the country were a little bit more, enlightened than others, but in generally speaking, there wasn't much of an educational mission as a nation prior to the Civil War. Now, after the Civil War, it became clear, during that early Reconstruction period, that we were going to have a way of rebuilding the infrastructure of the South, because the primary strategy near the end of the Civil War by the North was to destroy all the supply lines in the South. And so bridges were burned, barns were burned, granaries were burned, railroad bridges were burned or blown up, and railroads were, tracks were torn up, and lots of different things that the Union did to make sure the South couldn't supply what was left of the Southern Army. And so the Congress during Reconstruction realized that we're going to have to rebuild the South, and so we needed, and the border states, and we're going to have people that were skilled to do that. And that led to the Morrill Land Grant Act, in which really began in Congress in the late 1860s, but the actual effects of it in the early 1870s. And essentially what happened was the federal government set aside two substantial plots of land in each of the southern states and middle states, and eventually to all states. That one plot of land would be to provide for, and for the state to use to either build or provide funding for a technical and agricultural college. These were the land grant universities. And another plot, maybe a smaller plot, was set about to provide a space to provide the same sort of educational structure for a Black college. So even after the Civil War, it wasn't the intent that you would have, you would basically integrate these land grant universities. You'd have two versions of them in each state. And so in North Carolina, it's NC State and A&T, I think, was the Black land grant university. I may be wrong on that, I'm not sure. In Virginia, it was Virginia Tech and Virginia State. In Ohio, it was Ohio State and one of those places down south. In Pennsylvania, in southern Ohio, in Pennsylvania, it was Penn State and one of the Black colleges around Pittsburgh, I believe. But it was, that was the notion, that these places would serve to produce engineers and surveyors and people that could direct construction and things like that, so that we could rebuild the infrastructure. And that was the first time that federal dollars, in an indirect way, because they were land grants, was provided to the states to produce these universities. But as a result of that, it became very clear that depending on which state you were in, students were more or less ready to go to these universities, because there was no consistency between in public educational delivery across all the states. And so late in the 19th century, 1890s, maybe a little bit earlier than that, into the early part of the 20th century, businessmen, the big large businesses, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and what's his name with banking and all that, Morgan, they all got kind of interested in this education, because in public education, because they realized that they would have to have a consistent preparation to really make these land grant universities and these colleges useful to do what they were supposed to do. And that led to the Carnegie commissions and all that. Now, as I said, some states were more enlightened than others. In 1824, I think it was, somewhere along there, 1822, 1824, Thomas Jefferson pushed through the Virginia legislature a bill to create a compulsory required education up through the 5th grade for all students in Virginia. And the legislature kind of delayed that for a year. And then the year after that, they bought Jefferson off by allowing him to create a university. And so the University of Virginia was established But what was lost was that act to create a public education mandatory attendance for all students in Virginia, because legislature just didn't see how they could pay the cost of that. And so, as I said, some states were more enlightened than others. But anyhow, after all the Carnegie commissions and all that, we kind of standardized the way schools were structured. We standardized the curriculum to a certain extent, and we created ways of counting student successes in terms of what's still called the Carnegie units. And so, the curriculum was standardized. And by the way, that the Carnegie unit model was based on some of the more well-known liberal arts colleges at the time. So basically, Carnegie commissions looked at the what were going on in some of the liberal arts colleges and said, okay, well, that's working there. So why don't we put that down in public schooling? And that's the basic model we still are operating on today. And so by the beginning of World War I, we had an educational model that we still have today, essentially. After World War I, based on World War I was the first massive usage of achievement and aptitude testing. And it was built mostly around work done by Alfred Binet as he was developing his IQ test, but also he was also developing an achievement test, which was going to be a different thing, and eventually turned into what became the SATs a couple of decades later. But he was trying to evaluate these 4 or 5 million young men that were inducted into the military during World War I. And what they found was a stark outcome, that most of these folks that were indoctrinated or inducted both into the military during World War I were pretty ignorant and pretty illiterate, and didn't really have basic math skills or strong reading skills or awareness of history or cultures or whatever. And so the idea was that, okay, we need to do something to strengthen education in public schools, because the Carnegie Commission model wouldn't serve completely to help us build a workforce. And so what happened in 1914 was there was a federal act created called the Smith-Lever Act, and that began to provide federal funds to states for vocational training. And so, there was an additional amount of monies that was coming in for vocational training in public education, and it couldn't be spent any other way. That's the only way it could be spent. And that was one of the first uses of what was called earmarked money in the Congress. It was earmarked for a purpose, and the earmark was for vocational education. In 1917, the Smith-Lever Act was expanded and called Smith-Hughes Act, and provided substantial amounts of money to states to provide for vocational technical training. And the original areas were the FFA, farming, T&I, trade and industrial, some of those areas which were very much, where people were employed, because you were primarily still an agrarian society, so farming was a big deal. And there was a certain, skills that needed to be developed to be successful farmers, and T&I, tool and die makers, and working around machines and stuff like that. You couldn't depend upon blacksmiths and that sort of stuff. So we needed people that could have some skills in that. And so the amount of federal money greatly expanded that was coming into schools. And perhaps the federal money accounted for 10%, 15% of the money that was spent in public schools on education. And then in 1934, the Smith-Hughes Act was expanded to add all these other vocational areas, you know, distributive education for the retail trades, home ec for the, you know, skills and budgeting and raising a family and taking care of kids and all that, and a whole bunch more. And so we had a fairly robust pot of money that went into vocational ed. And that was kind of the way it stood up until the mid 1960s. So any thoughts, comments, questions about any of that rapid, brief, you know, 18-minute history of education in America? You knew all that, right? It's all right there. Okay. I just tapped into things you already knew. Okay. 1963 was a big year, lots of reasons. It wasn't such a good year, you know, for the presidency, but it was, because John Kennedy had some real aggressive, progressive ideas about education, about lots of things. But he was a Catholic from a rich family in Massachusetts and New England. And there were a lot of senators with a lot of power in other parts of the world, other parts of the country. And so none of his efforts were getting through Congress, with the exception of the Peace Corps, maybe, and some things like that. And then of course, we know what happened with Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson took over, and Lyndon Johnson was one of the more change-oriented presidents in modern history, in that he pushed through the education agenda that and a little bit more that Kennedy had wanted to push through. He pushed through all the civil rights actions. He pushed through the voting rights. He pushed through the housing rights. He pushed through you know, desegregation of schools. He pushed all those things through Congress because he played dirty, and he knew where all the secrets and where all the mistresses and where all the, you know, bribes and all that sort of stuff were that were taking place in Congress. And he wasn't above twisting arms and threatening people. And so he got all of those things done. Well, the only piece I'm going to talk about is the 1963 National Defense Education Act, which we still renew about every 5 years. And it was eventually called the No Child Left Behind. And now it's called ASA. And, you know, we just keep rolling it, changing its name. But it was, at the time in 1963, it was called the National Defense Education Act, because Russia with their Sputnik, and Russia with the first rocket, and Russia with the, you know, dogs and monkeys in space, and, you know, all of that had really scared America, because we were nowhere close. Our co-opted German Nazi scientists weren't as good as the Russians co-opted Nazi German scientists. At the end of World War II, we basically went in and grabbed all the scientists we could, because the Nazis, the Germans, were real good at science. And if the war had lasted another 6 months, we might all be speaking German today. But we grabbed all their scientists. Well, the Russians, evidently the group they got were better, because they got in space first with much less investment. And we weren't all that successful with it early. And so it was considered a national defense priority that our educational systems get better. And so, you know, that was one of Johnson's primary accomplishments, was to make sure that he couched it in terms of national defense, to get the National Defense Education Act through. And that led to a huge expansion in federal dollars coming into school, and a huge expansion of research about schools, about curriculums, about kids with disabilities, about gifted kids, about kids, you know, all kinds of kids. Bilingual education, or special ed came out of it. Public Law 94-142 came out. That's the Special Education Act. And so, you know, all those things came out of that National Defense Education Act funding for research. And there was a continuing pipeline of funding that kept coming. And as the years went on, it changed focus and it changed in different directions, but it was still this large amount of federal money, to the extent that now the dollars that are spent locally on each child, if you trace back the source of that money, and that includes pass-through monies that come through the states, you'll find that the federal dollars are probably as much as 40% of the per pupil expenditures in any school division. Now, some of that comes across the state money because it's called pass-through money. It comes to the state as block grants or entitlement grants or things like that. And so there is a requirement as to how it's spent. But the big stick, so to speak, from the feds to the states and from the states to the local divisions is money. That's why the local divisions have to do what they have to do to follow state guidance, because the state's doing what it has to do to follow federal guidance. Because to receive any federal money, the state has to guarantee certain compliance with federal statutes, federal laws, and federal policies. And so without that, you know, the states would be looking at 40% less money for schools, give and take. So, you know, that's kind of how we got where we were. We got from the position where we didn't have, our founding fathers didn't see education as a national priority or imperative, to the point we're at now where it is a national priority or imperative. But somehow caught up in that is, since it's not in the Constitution, it's by the Constitution itself, it is a power left to the states. But because the states can't afford to do it, it's always a little bit of a interaction, a little bit of a conundrum as to how things get done. But the leverage is always the money. It's always the dollars. And so that's how the feds make the states do what they want them to do, and that's how the states make the localities do what they want them to. Now, the localities may add to that money, and perhaps they spend another 30, 40%. And so the last 20%, 20, 25% of the school per pupil expenditures come from local dollars. And in almost all cases, except maybe larger cities, the local dollars is the largest part of a local budget. So when you have a local community, as much as 60 to 70% of their local budget will go into education funding. And that's why it's so hard to, there's always this notion about, you know, fixing schools, and we spend too much money on schools and things like that. So that's kind of the funding process. Now, North Carolina has an archaic way of allocating funds. They do it on what's called an allotment system. They take a pupil count on a census day, and they convert those pupil counts to position counts using a formula, and then they fund one allotment based on position counts. They have a second allotment that's based upon like the number of special ed kids, the number of, categorized kids, the number of ELL kids, the number of, whatever, kids that have a categorization, the amount of money that's required to be spent on vocational ed. And so that's an allotment that comes separately. And then they have a third allotment that's generally a smaller pool of money that has to do with state initiatives and may provide funds for staff development or, different things. But, it comes in like 3 different pots of money. And each one of those pots has a different set of guidelines around it. And it's kind of archaic because most states do a flat per pupil expenditure, that if you have X amount of students, you get so many dollars per student. And North Carolina is one of the handful of states that hasn't changed that, and they've had the same model for about 30 or 40 years. There is push to change that, but it never seems to get enough momentum because they can't figure out how to change it without it costing them more money. And that's always, dead in the water sort of thing. So that's the way funding happens. So that's the reason that the state code demands certain things out of the State Board of Education, which demands certain things out of local boards of education, which demands certain things out of local schools. Because that's the way the money flows. Now, you can read in fact, let me go over and just pull it up just for a sec. In the North Carolina State Code, and you have a link to this in your up on As You Learn. This is in North Carolina. It's Chapter 115C, which is the state code that deals with powers and duties of the state school board. And this sucker is 18 pages long in the code. Now, to save you the trouble of reading all 18 pages, which I assume you might want to do anyhow at some point in time, the state code breaks out the State Board of Education's requirements into 3 areas: requirements and duties. One of those is related to personnel. One of those is related to curriculum. And one of those is related to accreditation. And so there are a lot of things in here that define what makes an accredited local school division and local school. There are a lot of things in here that define state curriculum and what needs to be in state curriculum. But here's the division of power. By constitution, by state constitution, and every state's followed the same model except for maybe one. By state constitution, the state legislature has the power of the purse, and the State Board of Education has the power of making decisions about schools. And neither one can mandate to the other, but legislators learned a long time ago, if you put something in the state code, then the Board of Education has to respond to the state code. And so the Board of Education learned also that if it's something in the state code that requires a lot of money, then it's up to the state legislature to fund it because they required it to be done. And so there's always this dance that goes back and forth between the legislature and the state board as to what goes in there. But it's all around accreditation, it's around personnel, teacher accreditation, preparation of teachers, all that sort of stuff that's related to personnel, standards, like there's standards in here about planning time, you know, all that sort of stuff that's actually in the code. And then the third piece has to do with accreditation. So you got accreditation, curriculum, and personnel. And so that's what's in the state code. And there's lots of little nitpicky stuff in there in those 18 pages. And at some point in time, you really ought to kind of scan through those just to see what's in there. But we're not going to do that right now. We are, however, going to look at what's in the smaller section that talks about school improvement. Now, remember, this is state code, so this is law. And it defines the school improvement team who has to be on there. It defines the type of meetings, the type of public records that have to be provided and kept. You know, providing safety, the safety plan is the only thing that's not public record. There is a school improvement plan, and there are 8 things that have to be in the school improvement plan. And I would encourage you to look at your local school improvement plan to see if it's compliant with all 8 of these things. And one of them is the use of staff development funds, a plan to address safety and discipline, a decision to use state funds in according with any of the code. Basically, that says you have to speak to priorities within the code. Instructional practices and methods to be used. It may include requests for waivers from state laws or policies. Those are sometimes granted, sometimes they're not. During the pandemic, there have been a lot of waivers granted. A plan to create duty-free periods for each teacher on a daily basis. A plan to create duty-free instructional planning time for each teacher, separate things. And a plan to identify and eliminate unnecessary and redundant reporting requirements. And so those 8 things have to be in the school improvement plan. And so I would encourage you to look at your plan to make sure, you know, those things are in there. It has to be a school vote on it. There has to be some considerations at the superintendent and board level for school safety components of the plan, because sometimes schools can't do that. It has to be done at the division level. How the plan is to be adopted, the effective period of the plan, the elimination of other plans, unnecessary plans, and compliance with all requirements under these various state codes. Now, as a burgeoning administrator, and you can read that as well as I can, as a burgeoning administrator, my advice to you is to know the code around school improvement very well, and the state code around board responsibilities, know the general guidance in there. Because a lot of stuff happens every legislative session that may drop things out of the state code requirements of the state board, or throw things in there requirements of the state board. And these plans are meant to be rolled over. They're meant to be, as you evaluate and measure benchmarks within these plans, the idea is that the next plan, the next iteration for the next year, will incorporate what you've learned from the previous year. But nothing ever disappears. And all things have to be monitored on an ongoing, continuous basis. And that's part of the accreditation requirement too, that there has to be this monitoring of this plan. And so, there may be some things in there that may have surprised you. in terms of what the code requires, what the law requires. And so, you know, and is there a penalty attached to it? Well, the only penalty attached to anything is, you know, some state funds disappearing. And given the shoestrings that school divisions operate on, you can't afford to lose any monies. And so basically you try to as much as possible meet what the state board requires. So are any of you thinking you might have plans, school plans that might not be in total compliance? Worth looking at, just to think about. Because if you do everything, there's really no reason that you should have an issue if you do things properly, and then you monitor it and roll it over year to year to year. Yeah, it becomes an ongoing improvement process. Yeah. Katie, do you have something you want?
Does anybody have a duty-free lunch? Is that like, we don't? I didn't know that was something that we were supposed to even have here. We eat with the kids and watch them. We don't have that.
Yeah. Well, look at the language. It does not necessarily say a duty-free lunch. It says a duty-free period, which a lot of schools have decided includes lunch period, and a duty-free time for planning. And the intent was that would occur during the school day. And some school divisions have incorporated it into a longer school day. And part of the reason the 4x4 was so popular there for a while is that it allowed you to identify 8 periods of work for teachers. And so you could kill 2 birds with 1 stone if you had 1 period free. 1 block free. Because you could constitute that as 2 periods. So, yeah, thoughts about that, or complaints about that, or gripes about that, or anything about that. You know, we kind of operate on the king of the castle sort of model in public schooling. Most places do. And so the person is actually responsible at the state level for making sure that all these things occur is a state superintendent. And the person that's responsible at the local division level to make sure all these things occur is the superintendent of schools. Because the local board has vested him with the powers and responsibilities to do that. And the person at the building level who is responsible for making sure these things occur is the principal. Whoever ultimately signs the checks also accepts the responsibility to make sure these things happen. And it's considered a fiduciary responsibility, which basically means, you know, it's related into monitoring of money. So it is, you know, it's something occasionally people get in trouble over. It doesn't happen very often, but I mean, you can do foolish things to get in trouble. One of the reasons that there's an exemption for charter schools is that charter schools also are able to get waivers from credentialing. And often you'll have people in running charter schools that are not necessarily trained or credentialed in all the finance elements and all that sort of stuff with schools. So it is they thought they wouldn't get any charter schools off the ground if charter schools had to meet the same credentialing requirements as all regular schools. Now, many charter schools do. Many charter schools have made that decision, but not all have. And the code allows for some leeway for charter schools. You can look up charter schools in the state code too, if you want to, and figure what they want you to do at charter schools. Well, I told you I'd do a quick and dirty pass through of the education of the history of public education in America and historical precedents for those things, and the way in which funding occurs and the way in which school improvement flows out of that history and funding and flows out of the state level. And to my count, I am 4 minutes short. So what do you want to talk about? Since you don't have any questions.
Dr. Bolt, I was going to make the point. I think so many people overestimate the power that the federal government has in education. I think they do in some degree, specific to funding. But I think a lot of people think, and I think we saw a lot of this with the appointment of the last education secretary, that the federal government is mandating all education policy. And I think, in general, people fail to realize that states and school LEAs have a significant amount of autonomy in making those types of decisions. So I think that sometimes that misconception becomes convoluted in discussions.
Yeah, it can. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that we do. Well, we actually sometimes we want the feds to fix things. I kind of come at it from that direction. And the only thing the feds can throw at it is money, because that's the only string they pull. That's the only string they have. It's the only leverage they have. And so the only thing they can throw at it is money. And if they don't throw money at it, they can mandate whatever the hell they want to, and states can pretty much say, well, you're not funding that, so I don't need to worry about that. And so it becomes kind of that. That's not exactly true, because states have to respond to federal law. And so if it ends up being a part of the federal code, then the state has to do something about it. I mean, and that's why all the civil rights issues and things like that, that was pretty much settled back during the desegregation era by several Supreme Court cases, that the states do have a lot of leeway, but at the same time, if it's a general federal law, and there are several federal laws that respond to that, states had to desegregate, and they also were under a requirement for compulsory education, which is in the federal code. And so a state can't shut down its educational system. And like Virginia and some places in the South, and actually a couple places in the North, tried to do that, and it just didn't work out. They end up running askance of the federal courts and all kinds of things when you try to do that. And so it's federal power is driven by money and federal code. And if you pass a law that requires the states and localities to make significant changes, then you also have to figure out a way of funding it. You could pass a law saying, we're going to set a per pupil ratio in the entire country of 10-1. Be a neat law, but unless you put, $500 billion with it every other year, it's not going to do you any good, because states are going to say, we can't fund that because you didn't provide us, the funds, the type of resources we need to do that. So there is a dance, and there is politics, and all those things happening, but behind the scenes, there's always the Department of Education, which is constantly working with state departments of education, and the State Department of Education is constantly working with colleges and universities and local education agencies. And so they're always trying to work out ways of doing what needs to be done without any more conflict that needs to happen. And so, yeah, I mean, localities have a great deal of leeway, and principals are the king or queen of their castle. You know, that's kind of how we pursue that. But they're also the person that's you know, the easiest target, because you know, we put people on pedestals or at the top of pyramids just so we can get a better shot at them. And so you know, that's kind of the way it works. But I would encourage you to look at least the state code part that deals with school improvement, to see that you know that kind of inside and out, how these teams have to be put together, how they have to be operated, all those things, because that's part of accreditation. And you know, how does the state you know, police accreditation? Money, dollars. Because if you're accredited, you can't receive state funds, but you can't receive federal funds either. And so, you know, there is this constant accreditation thing, and everybody remembers what happened in Burke County real quickly when they were at risk of losing their accreditation. I mean, they were going to lose most of their budget from federal dollars, lose all their Title I funds, lose all their vocational funds, lose all, I mean, basically they were not going to be accredited. And changes happen quickly. Changes happen quickly. So it is that, you know, it's kind of that process that you have to be aware of, and at least know that you're in compliance. Now, you may not be in compliance 100% letter and law, but you need to be in good faith in compliance, because then you can always make the case you're in good faith. Other questions, thoughts? Please take a good look at the material dealing with opportunity gaps. There's a series of resource readings. There's a series, there's a couple of little videos in there. I'm asking the groups, and I'll put this in another email, I'm asking the groups to come together, you know, sometime either during class time next week or sometime over the next week or so, and kick that around for a little while, just for each individual to talk about, you know, kind of what their thoughts are on it, and to help you get some feedback on where you need to be going with that. And we're kind of encouraging the peer-to-peer thing simply because that's the best, your best resource right now is there are, what, there are 15, 16 people in here, and what, 8 or 10 school divisions represented in here or more. And so, you know, you have some resource there that you can talk to. You know, I have my experiences, but they're a bit more limited, and they're not, I don't encounter them day to day. You have to see them from up here. You know, I guess now we would call it the drone level. We used to call it the 20,000 foot level. Now it's the drone level. And so you can see things moving and changing, but you can't see kind of the dirt on the ground, so to speak. You can't see what's happening in local schools. And so we encourage that sort of peer-to-peer thing. Any other thoughts? Any questions? Here's my third plea, third sales pitch. If you need, run into thing and you need help, guidance, clarification, whatever, it's up to you. Contact me. We'll set something up. We'll do it individual to individual if that's what you need, or we'll do it individual to group if that's what you need. But I need a request. I need you to let me know that that's what you need. And I will be there, because the month of April, I'm just reading your stuff. All right, folks. Nothing else. See you in a couple weeks. Have a good one. Stay safe. And, take care of yourselves.